During my time at Georgia Tech, I got to intern at Google.
Would you say that that degree essentially gives you a foundation in all things design?
I work on the AI team for Microsoft Edge.
Most of the work that you do on a daily isn't just like design oriented, it needs to be coupled with the tech.
I'm not allowed to share anything about confidential company stuff.
What's your take on all the Internet Explorer memes? Do those just annoy you?
If you tell your parents I'm going to be your designer, the first thing they think of is, does this guy want to be like a struggling graphic artist that makes no money? I worked on Google Cloud and then I'm working on Edge, which if you think about it, they're both underdogs of the opposite company.
Are you a believer in the concept of objectively good aesthetics in terms of design? I'm looking to distill some of your expertise on this subject of aesthetic design and what looks good visually in a way that's translatable for lay people like me.
There's so much signals and telemetry and stuff that you can look at to see if you change the design of a tab, are people using tabs less?
The next time I'm trying to install Chrome and it's like, are you sure you want to do that? I know who to go to for that feedback. Welcome to the Ready, Set, Do podcast, where we discuss journeys of not experts who are just 2 steps ahead of us. I'm Naman Pandey, and in this episode, my guest is Tushar Gupta. Tushar is a senior product designer at Microsoft AI, specifically leading the charge with the recent wave of developments that we've seen on Microsoft Edge. Being somebody that comes from tech and interacts with technology on a daily basis and always wonders about exactly how product designers come up with ideas and implement them, I seized this opportunity to ask Tushar a bunch of questions that I've always had. We begin our discussion by going over the human-computer interaction course that Tushar studied at Georgia Tech and exactly what that entails in terms of not just software design but also hardware product. We then deep dive into the similarities and differences between UI, UX, and product design. Obviously, I had to use this opportunity to ask Tushar how Microsoft engineers feel about all the Internet Explorer jokes, and his response may or may not surprise. On a more serious note, however, it was astonishing to discover the amazing pace at which big tech performs numerous incremental upgrades to existing softwares that are sometimes used by tens of millions of people. We then go over some design tips that Tushar has learned throughout his career that any layperson can use in their day-to-day life, be it while designing flyers or birthday cards, or maybe just in their presentations at work. This discussion is for any person that envisions a future in product design for themselves, or any person that's curious to learn about how design changes are pushed across products that they use on a daily basis. In keeping with our theme of learning from somebody that's just 2 steps ahead of us instead of an expert, my goal with this discussion is to shine a light on Tushar's incredible journey through first learning about product design and then implementing changes that impact millions of lives on a daily basis. This is the Ready, Set, Do podcast, and to support it, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And now, my friends, without any further ado, my discussion with Tushar. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Naman.
For our listeners and myself, do you mind giving a quick outline of kind of your career trajectory since you finished your master's? I believe it was at Georgia Institute of Technology, and kind of how you got to your current role at Microsoft, working on product design and or UX.
Yeah, definitely. So, hey everyone, I'm Tushar. I think I want to start a little bit like further from like the Georgia Tech thing. I think
even better.
Helpful, but yeah. But I think, I got into UX from a very like early age. I would say like, I didn't even know it was called UX at the time. It was more of like graphic design. And I think I really have my brother to thank for that decision, because he is like 5 years older to me. And I saw him like get into code when he was in high school and I was sort of like in middle school or like 7th grade, I believe. And it sort of just feels like such a natural journey from that point, right? Because like I got into Photoshop, I was like doing graphic design for the longest time. And then that interest sort of like seeing my brother build things, it made me sort of want to build things. So I started learning like a little bit of programming. And then I did my undergrad in CS, which was still like at that point, I think when I was just starting my undergrad, like product design or UX design in India really wasn't like a well-known field. I don't think there were a lot of like courses that you could really do. It was all just called design, right? And it was very hardware and physical in nature. But I think at that point, I had to take a call that, hey, like, am I going to stick with a safe career choice at the moment? And I think, my parents also had a role to play. Like, when you tell as a brown kid in India, like if you tell your parents that, hey, you know what, I'm going to be a designer, the first thing they think of is like, oh, like, does this guy want to be like a struggling graphic artist that makes like no money?
Yeah, it's like the arts and humanities where you're struggling to put food on the table. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's like that taboo that goes with like creative fields in our country. But I think, to be honest, like it's gotten so much better since then. But
for sure,
when I was still in like undergrad, I chose the safer path in some ways, right? Like I chose CS, but at the same time, because it was sort of like I knew that I would be good at CS, right? Because I was already building things on the side. I enjoyed programming, but all throughout those 4 years, even in India, like I always had like a design inclined mind, right? Like I was always focusing on not just the code that I was writing, but also asking myself the why behind those things, and like the focusing a little bit more than my classmates on like the way that things look. And I think those experiences really helped me because, you know, I was able to get like a UX internship in India, which also at that point was not like a formal process. Like it was just me reaching out to a bunch of designers on LinkedIn who work at these like top design companies in India. I remember one of them was ClearTrip at the time. Like you might remember it being like a very like iconic product design company. And like, so I messaged someone at ClearTrip. They were like, oh yeah, like you have a portfolio, which at that point, a lot of people didn't even have a portfolio, right?
I mean, I feel like still, even today, a lot of people don't. And so just for context, what year was this? Just for me to contextualize.
So this was in 2018. Yeah.
Okay.
2018.
Awesome.
So yeah, I'm not that old, but I think like from the Indian product design industry standpoint, like there weren't a lot of people in 2018 who like were young designers, I would say. Like
especially CS majors, I feel like, you know?
Yeah, it really took off, I would say, somewhere around like 2020, like during COVID and stuff, like all the cohort courses and such, like so many like courses. But yeah, basically I did that internship at ClearTrip in 2018. And at that point I was like, hey, like I am so sure that I want to do product design, right? Like this is like so much more relevant to me than just being like a software engineer, because at that point, since I said I had an elder brother, like he was a software engineer, and I saw the kinds of things like he was doing every day versus the kinds of things I did as a product designer. And I really enjoyed the design part a lot more. So I think, yeah, like that's what led me to applying to a bunch of these colleges for my master's. And I was fortunate enough to get into Georgia Tech with like a scholarship. So like that's where I went. And during my time at Georgia Tech, I got to intern at Google in like the summer between the 2 years, which was again like an amazing experience. Like, you know, it was sort of like a dream company for me at that point. And I really enjoyed that experience. And then, you know, I interviewed full time at a bunch of other places and decided to choose Microsoft because of the sort of product that I would be working on. And the product that I work on right now is like the browser. So basically Microsoft Edge. I work on the AI team for Microsoft Edge. Like how do we bring in the goodness of Copilot and AI into like an everyday product like a web browser.
Awesome. And then what was your master's degree in? Like what was your course called exactly?
So my master's degree was in human-computer interaction, which sounds super technical. It feels like, you know, like it's a little bit of robotics, but I think that's just been like the scientific term for like product design and HCI. But I would say, you know, it is a very broad term. Like as an HCI major, you can do so many separate things inside that, right? And like product and like UX design is just a very small part of it.
Totally. I actually happened to study a human-computer interaction course at the industrial engineering school at Purdue for my master's. So
nice.
Very weirdly, yeah, I know that. First of all, I know how niche it is and how few people might be, you know, familiar with that. But it's kind of funny that I have happened to study that exact thing. And yeah, to your point, I can relate to just how broad it is. I feel like the biggest things I remember from that was like there was like a little case study around. They changed like buttons on a cockpit of like a certain plane.
Yeah.
And because of that, the whole industry for a couple of months went haywire because, you know, just how humans are used to like use your left hand for this, right hand for that. And if you screw that around too much, it's, you know, things start to break or systems start to suffer. So
yeah,
that's very interesting, I guess. Do you mind shedding some more light on the type of courses that you're taught within that degree, just for It's just like an outline for, our listeners.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best part of my like HCI degree at Georgia Tech was definitely the diversity in courses, right?
Right.
So I think the best way to describe it is that we had 4 tracks inside the program, right? Like you could choose between interactive computing, which is basically like all the CS and like, coding focused part of the degree, or you could have like a focus in like psychology, which is again like a huge part of like design. So interactive computing, psychology, literature, media and communication, that was the third. And then the fourth was industrial design. So just as those terms sound, it's exactly that, right? Like there are courses in all of these tracks and like you choose to specialize in one, but you get to take courses from all 4.
All of them.
So by the end of your degree, like it's really up to you. Like, do you want to be like more psychology focused? So a lot of like user researchers, for example, do that. Like they focus on psychology and it takes them like through a journey of like, hey, like how do you interview people? How do you like become a part of their lives to see like and observe their behaviors and things like that? Versus industrial design is more of like, hey, like there are people from that school of like industrial design that have gone on to work at Apple and such. So like they actually work on the hardware design of how AirPods are made. So there's so many separate parts of design and like, just the feeling that you have when you use an Apple product of like you're opening that AirPods box and how like that experience, that magnetic sort of like closing and opening thing versus like as soon as you bring it closer to your phone, the way that the screen pops up with that, hey, like, is this the thing that you want to connect? Like all of that to me feels like a part of product design.
That's just, I mean, I feel like going back to get another master's, the way it all sounds so amazing. Can I ask which specialization you chose out of the 4 you referenced?
Right. So I think I decided to play it a little safe and I had spoken to a lot of like previous students and such. And I knew that for the skill set that I have, the safest major for me is interactive computing, which is basically I would have had to take a few more courses than the other tracks in interactive computing, right? And I just like, looking at all the coursework and such, like I wanted to make sure that I do have a focus. And I think like even as I talk about my work at the moment, I think every designer sort of has a superpower, right? Like it's important that you distinguish yourself from your colleagues in different ways. And, for everyone, it's a different thing. But for me, it's my ability to connect the technical parts of design to like the visual parts of it. So like on my example, like I'm the guy who can like design something, but also talk to the devs about it in a way that feels very like relevant to them. And like I'm the one who can like sort of build designs in a way that feel feasible to them. So like I might not be the most like visual designer. Like there's a stereotype with like a lot of visual designers that, they can make the prettiest thing, but then when they show it to the developers, they're like, like we're never going to build this. So like it's good to have a balance, but I think for me, like that superpower is just about the ability to like think of a design as something that can be built, but at the same time also help in building it.
That's so interesting to me. I guess just to drill down on your experience at Georgia Institute, just one more level, would you say that that degree essentially gives you a foundation in all things design? So it's not just software design or the way a certain app looks once you load it, the way the fonts interact, the colors interact with the background, etc. But also on a more higher level, the hardware aspects that you referenced, such as with the AirPods, how to design all of those things. In my mind, those sound kind of really disparate things. I just, I'm kind of struggling to ascertain how the same person could, be, at least a master, maybe not a master, but well-versed in both of those fields. So is my understanding correct? And if not, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say that it's more of like you get a sense of everything. You're not, I don't think you can be a master of all of those things. I'm sure some like people with a lot of experience can be. But for me, it was the ability to sort of, as you said, like develop a foundation and all these different things and like choose like basically how much you want to invest in each of those skills, right? Because ideally, like it's almost, I like to think of myself as like a T-shaped designer, right? Like So like you have a breadth of knowledge in all of these different fields, but you can go deep in one layer. And like, I think there was a very interesting tweet that I saw yesterday about like the age of AI, right? Like what does it mean to be like in a tech field during AI? And basically someone said that it's much better to be a generalist with like some specialized knowledge rather than a specialist in like one very specific thing. Wow. Because it's almost like, like when you think of AI and how it's like affecting software developers at the moment, like it can write code for you, but it can't like think to the level that maybe you can think of at the moment, right? So it's almost like it's not about your job being replaced. It's about how you get smarter at doing the things that you're doing and increase your scope so the lower level tasks can be helped with in terms of like the AI that is your companion. It develops a foundation for you, but you get to choose what areas you want to go deep in.
Awesome. So with that, let's fast forward a little bit to, your graduation day. You finally made it, pat yourself on the back, and you have a job lined up at Microsoft. Is it? So when you started, I'm assuming AI wasn't a thing at the time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to contrast a little bit between your day in the life at the time, say at your first month at Microsoft versus right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my first month was a little bit of me being a sponge, right? Like, because when you join a company, like a big company like Microsoft, like on your first day, like you interact with so many people who have been at this company for like 10 years plus, right? Like veterans basically who have seen so many products being built, being shipped, having like some products that fail and like learning from those things. And like, I think especially as like a new grad, and like the advice that I always give like people who join our team now is to just listen and absorb, right? Like your job, especially as a designer, like sometimes it's really easy to come into a new team and basically just question everything that you see and be like, hey, like, why does this look so ugly? Like, why does this function this way? And like basically raise a lot of questions without really understanding the context of those things. So my first month, and this is something I learned from my internship as well, right? Because Google is also like a huge company, and having worked at that environment, I think my first month was basically setting up a lot of one-on-ones with everyone on my team, but also like my sister teams, and just asking them more about, hey, like, what are the things that you worked on? Like, what are the things that you like about the team? What are things that you wish were better? And like, what's some advice that you would give to someone who's joining at this moment? So it's important for you to understand the dynamics of the team that you're joining. So in that sense, like my manager was kind enough to put me on like some smaller tasks to sort of like ramp up, understand like the product that I'm building, like start small with like things that are pretty straightforward, but still require some level of thought to like get to a finished stage. When I think of those moments and now I fast forward, like, so I just finished 3 years at Microsoft today, funnily enough. And
congrats, man.
Yeah, thank you. And as I like contrast it to my life today, like now I'm just like on my own leading like big projects and like working with so many different stakeholders, like leading the design, like having so much more of an opinion. And I think all of that comes from finding your voice as a designer, right? And I'm saying this in the field of design, but anyone at any job, right? Like I think it holds true for them. Like the longer you have been associated with a certain project, like the more you feel like you have the confidence of, hey, like I've seen this being built before. This is what we learned from it. Like, here's what we can do differently this time. So that sort of contrast is so crazy to me because I would have never thought that this is the level of autonomy I would have at this point in my career. But it's sort of like a whirlwind, right? Like you just like go with the flow, and like this is where like life has taken me in the last few years.
What were some of the products that you were working on when you first started? I guess what was some of the things that you got to get your hands dirty with right off the bat, especially around, design or that entire umbrella of expertise?
Yeah. I think the best thing about a web browser is that everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? Like everyone uses a web browser, even if you don't use Microsoft Edge, like everyone's familiar with these concepts and like the things inside a web browser interface because they use it every single day. So I remember some of the very initial things that I worked on were more of like small utilities, right? So I remember one of the first things was like a control F experience. So like when you're finding something on a page, how can you make that experience slightly better than what exists in the browser today? And like, I think everyone's first thought when you work on something as fundamental as a web browser is, dude, like, I understand how a web browser works. Like, why, like, what do you need to design in this thing, right? Like, it's built, I use it every day and like, it works. So like, you know, it's sort of like that thing, like if it isn't broke, like then don't fix it.
Yep.
But it's about those tiny moments of delight, right? Because we shipped a feature for like Find On page where it was like, you can ask more like pointed questions, like you can match case, you can like search for synonyms and such based on the word that you're searching for. And it's those tiny features that bring about such a big delight in users, right? Because they don't expect that functionality from a thing as simple as that. But when you show it to them, they're like, oh, like this is amazing. Like I would have never thought of this, but I'm glad you built it. So those were some of the things that I was working on when I joined. As you could see, like it's pretty small in scope. Like, I don't know, like maybe 5 or 10% of all web browsing users probably have ever interacted with the Control F thing in their lives. But now,
I'd probably
like
say more, honestly. Yeah,
maybe,
I would probably say more, yeah. But yeah, I get your point though, yeah.
But now, like when I think about the things that I'm doing now, it's more of like I'm working on things like tabs. So now I'm working on, hey, like what happens when you have a bunch of tabs open? Like, should AI be able to help you group those things? And like, does that help you get back to them faster when you close the browser and open it back up again? So like, obviously you could see like the difference in scope that 3 years makes. And yeah, I've been really excited about working on stuff like that.
That's really incredible. So a couple things to call out there. One of them is non-serious. The other actually is actually a relevant question. The first is, what's your take on all the Internet Explorer memes? Do those just annoy you? Is that I'm very curious to hear the temperature on the Microsoft floor when those were a thing. I guess they aren't really a thing anymore. But how did you all deal with that?
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? Because obviously, like I wasn't a part of the team when like Edge was launched, but I hear a lot about just like the market perception of a brand, right? And how hard it is to get over that brand and that perception. So in some ways, yeah, like we all know that Microsoft, Internet Explorer was like a great browser, like it was ahead of its time. And at some point, they sort of just, like things weren't being innovated as much. And that's how like Chrome got its entry, and now it's like the incumbent, right? Like we all know that story. But there's something really nice, like at least as a designer, because I used to work on Google Cloud during my internship, and you might know this, but Google Cloud is not like the biggest cloud in the world, right? Like it's Azure and like AWS that are sort of ahead in the field, and then Google Cloud is sort of like the underdog in that space. And when you work for an underdog, so in this example, like, I worked on Google Cloud and then I'm working on Edge, which if you think about it, they're both underdogs of the opposite company.
True. Yeah, I love that analogy. You're spot on there.
Yeah. And I think the exciting part as a designer is that when you're the underdog, you get to experiment with a lot more things that you would if you were the incumbent, right? Because when you are the biggest player in the market, like you want to keep things stable and you want to like stick to what works. But as the underdog, like you get to experiment with a bunch of different things, and it's sort of something that is really exciting to me as a designer because it allows me to think outside of the box.
Love that candid response there. My actual, serious question around that was, it almost seems to me that this is like a very, I would say, happy marriage between, so like what you referenced with the Control F functionality. I would not have put that firmly under the product design box. So I guess what I'm getting at is there's a decent element of, still computer science or like coding involved with that still. So am I right in assuming that most of the work that you do on a DD isn't just, like design oriented? It needs to be coupled with the tech. You need to understand how it works with the tech, because if not, then you're probably, maybe just wasting time. Would you say that's right? Or is that like a step that comes later down the road?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Like the best designers that I know are people who work hand in hand with like the technology that they're developing, right? And like the AI thing, like maybe we'll talk about it later, but it it has changed things a little bit because it has really made a difference in what we know or think is possible right in front of our eyes. But for something like Control F, like I can have design ideas for it, but I need to keep talking to my devs and like my product managers to make sure that, hey, like, does this make sense? Like, do we feel like this is something that we can go achieve in the short term and the long term and the medium term? Like, these are very like product level discussions that you have every day in this job. And yeah, like I think the best partnerships are where you have like a very healthy line of communication between all of these different roles. But I have also seen scenarios where like, designers are being used as a service, which is basically like, the PM comes to you with a very specific requirement. They're like, hey, like, can you give me like these three things? And that's it. And the designer just does it. And then the PM has no further communication with the designer. They just take that, give it to the engineer, and then work with the engineer on getting it built. And the designer, and in some points, doesn't even ever see the final product. So that's like the bad way of doing it, I would say. But unfortunately, sometimes that's how it is. But with most of the things that designers work on, like it's that healthy line of communication at every step of the way. You can imagine like when you are developing a feature, like it's more designer research heavy at the front side of it because you're figuring out what to build, what to test, what users are going to think about it. But then the second half of it is always more like dev focused because they're actually going to go and build the things. And like they might come back to you and say, hey, like, you know what? Like initially we thought we could do this, but like we looked into it and it doesn't feel like a good like experience. Like it's going to take too long to load. So like, can we reiterate on something here? And that's when you have to go back and be like, okay, I'm going to put on like my realistic hat now.
On the interplay around the product manager, product designer, and like the people that actually design, or the designer themselves, or maybe I actually don't know who those people, what they would be called, maybe just developers. Say you're trying to add a new feature to Edge. So like maybe you're aware of this, but like there's a big upheaval around Opera making a comeback. They have a bunch of really new, cool, flashy features where they're like some of the stuff that you mentioned. So like it'll automatically combine all of your tabs of like a similar nature, save RAM, all of that good stuff. So I guess my question is, who comes up, like who owns, say an enhancement, we'll call it, to these products? So is it the product manager, or is it, like your job to do that?
I think the best enhancements are thought of by anyone, right? Obviously, like everyone keeps a close eye on their competitors. And just like you mentioned, like there's so many browsers that are doing great things in the space, right? And, some features work for certain browsers, but might not work for other browsers, right? For example, like Edge is the browser that's like pre-installed on every Windows device, right? Yep. So if we do something too drastic without testing it with like the audience that we have, then we have the risk of like people just being so confused with what a browser can be or should be. So like every, like I would say, app has their own challenges. Like they need to know their user audience well and make sure that they're designing for them, right? So I'm like, sometimes I'm really inspired by the stuff that Opera is doing, or like even other smaller browsers are doing. And like, I definitely keep an eye out and see if there's anything new in the market that we need to be thinking about. But to your question about who comes up with these ideas, like I think the best ideas, as I mentioned, are from anyone. Like I could look at something, or like I could be like designing something, and it just like gets a spark that, hey, like what if this was this way instead of like the way that it is right now? And then, you talk to your PMs and you talk to your fellow designers, you mock something out, and that's the beauty of where design shines, right? Like it is so much cheaper to prototype an idea out in design than for me to go to a developer and say, hey, you know what, like leave everything that you're doing, go build this out for me and let's think about it. So that's where designers really come in. Like a lot of people think that like your satisfaction as a designer comes from like, hey, like here's all the things that I've changed or like shipped in a product, right? So for example, like I could be the person that says, hey, like, I've like improved the control find experience on Edge. But I think it's less about the things that you ship. Obviously, it's great when something ships, but it's about all the ideas that you tried on the drawing board and you confirmed that they were not great ideas, right?
Yeah.
Because you save like probably millions of dollars in like developer time to like actually go and build those things.
Right. It's like almost not shooting yourself in the foot is in fact a privilege, even though a lot of people might not look at it that way. But with stuff like this, I can appreciate the willingness to go overboard and do something that wasn't really needed or that wasn't vetted enough and then pay the price for that. So I completely relate almost to what you're saying around like little increments, baby steps, don't break what you have, don't alienate the customer base you have, and kind of build from there. Shifting gears just a little bit, I'm hoping we can bust some myths around, essentially like your field of work, so to speak. So what is, for a layperson such as myself, the difference between product design and UX? And maybe if you're willing, we can throw their little cousin UI somewhere in there as well, if at all it's relevant to that question.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's obviously a thing that's like one of the most asked things. And I would say everyone has a different answer to this. And
interesting.
The biggest problem is that a lot of these terms are used interchangeably, right? Like people, like, for example, UI and UX, like people say I'm a UI UX designer, right? Or like in my case, like my official designation is a product designer, right? So every company, every person, like they have a different take on this. But for me, like having taken a bunch of courses at Georgia Tech that sort of like dive into some of these topics a little bit more, the way that I understand these things is that UI UX is a subset of product design, right? Product design to me is like the whole experience of using a product. So like going back to that AirPods example, like it goes from like how the software interplays with the hardware, the feeling that you get of using the hardware, to like, I could even zoom out a step further and it's like, it's the experience of buying a product itself, right? Like what is that seamless experience of like getting to that experience of like buying that thing and then opening that product, that like taking off that seal, everything is a part of it, right? So it becomes really hard for one person to be like the product designer for every step of the experience, because you can imagine so many different people and so many different like teams being a part of this whole experience, right? So that to me is like product design. It's like all of these different steps of like ideation, strategy, visual design, like prototyping an experience out, and even marketing. Like how do you market this thing and find the right amount of users for whatever you're building? But UI and UX design, it sort of stands for user interface and user experience. And people use these terms together because the user experience is about the interaction, right? Like,
correct.
How does this thing move? And how does it sort of feel usable? Does it like feel enjoyable to the user? Is there a moment of like delight? Is there a certain animation? Like, for example, I remember when you book something on Airbnb, like there's like a nice check mark and like some confetti and stuff that they throw around. And like, it just feels really delightful. You feel good after using the product. And the last part of it feels like accessibility, like there's a huge portion of the audience in this world that, has like some sort of accessibility issues or impairments that we need to always keep in mind as we're designing things. So like whether it be color blindness, like low eyesight or low vision, basically, there's a lot of things that you need to make sure to confirm that the thing that you're shipping or designing, especially when a company like Microsoft does something, that it works for everyone, not just like a certain subset of the audience. So that is more like user experience, but then, like user interfaces, more of like the visuals and like the spacing, the typography, the hierarchy, the colors that you're using. I haven't met a lot of people who are just like UI designers anymore. Like it's sort of like a part of the job description to be good at both. And but there are some like very specific roles where visual design really plays a big role. Like when you're someone like an illustrator, then you are pretty much a visual designer working on like making certain like brand assets that go in certain other marketing things. But from a UI UX perspective, I do think most people are considered to be like proficient in both when you're like working in the field.
Yeah, thanks for that amazing deep dive. Are you a believer in the concept of objectively good aesthetics in terms of design? Obviously, I'm speaking under that umbrella, versus objectively bad aesthetics. And we'll get to the second part of the question in just a second, but this one's just a yes or no.
I mean, yes, I think my short answer is yes. Like there are certain decisions that you can take when you're developing something that just from like the standard paradigms and so much of the literature that has been written about like user experience design, that there are some like red flags that you have to keep in mind and avoid as you're building things.
Perfectly segues into my second part of that question. So the stuff you mentioned around paradigms and the literature, that's I'm sure that you are very well versed with, but I'm not, and I believe most of our listeners probably would not be. Really what I'm getting at, Tushar, is for people that just in their day in the lives are doing some designing. For instance, I'm doing like YouTube thumbnails for my videos, or there might be a person that's making like a flyer for a party that they have next weekend. What are some design tips that you've learned through your entire journey that are almost, and you can treat it as like a red flag question also, either works. But really, I'm looking to distill some of your expertise on this subject of aesthetic design and what looks good visually in a way that's translatable for lay people like me and maybe other listeners that are interested in design, but for whatever reason don't have the resources or, ability to sift through all that literature and don't know those paradigms.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question, but also a really hard one because because there's so much that someone can say about what is considered good design, but when YouTube or Reddit, when they go through redesigns, there's always like a loud minority voice that says that, hey, like I hate this, like why did you change this? Like I love the old layout better, like I want to go back to it. But then you look at your user signals and it's like most of the people like this thing, like everyone's happy, like people are spending more time inside the app and everything works, right? Coming back to your question about like design tips, I think to me it's just about developing like a design eye, right? You don't have to be a designer to have a design eye, right? I think it's more about just almost like understanding the intention behind the things that you see every day. Like, and this, like, I remember there's books and stuff that talk about this, but like next time you're using an elevator, think about all the different kinds of elevators that you've been in, right?
Yeah.
Like some of them have like a way to enter the like the floor before you enter the elevator, right? Like on that screen. Others have it like inside, and like think about every single thing that you basically do. And this is like such a meta point, but every single product or experience that you use was built a certain way by people to help you get something done with that product, right? And then like then the second step is like, how do you apply those things to the things that you are creating, right? So it's more about like how people are going to experience the thing that you're making. So for example, like you mentioned YouTube thumbnails, right? When you look at successful creators, you will start to see patterns with how they do their thumbnails.
Exactly.
Right? Like there's one big appealing thing in each thumbnail, and the rest of it is sort of like a supporting act to make sure that your eyes go towards that main thing. So a lot of people, when they think about design, like I think their thing is like, hey, you just need something visual and flashy, like everywhere, right? Like they forget that concept of like, not every single part of your design has to be attention grabbing. It's almost like the opposite effect, right? Like if everything is screaming for attention, then nothing is really attention grabbing. So that would be my biggest tip. I think like there is beauty in like minimalism, right? And this is like a very designer opinion, so sometimes I cringe about it as well. But like basically less is more, right? Like let your content and your story shine through, no matter if it's a thumbnail, it's a flyer, like perceive it the way that the reader or the viewer will perceive it, right? I know like as creators, it's really easy to like over explain. Like, for example, you're writing a flyer about something, you're the expert in that topic. That's why you're writing that thing, right? So it's so easy to say that, hey, like you need to know this. This is what is important. This is what other people said. This is what the research says. But like it's compared to a story of a movie that you really like. Like, did they tell you everything about the story in the first 10 minutes? No, right? Like they built it up to you. Like they hooked you in. And that's how they got you to stay till the end to see the payoff. So that's what you need to do with your design work as well. And
I really should, and I'm sure we will be connecting offline after this, but I'm going to request that you review the thumbnails that I have, because I feel like your opinions there would be extremely valuable for me. Because I mean, candidly, when I first said that's a tough question, I was like, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, because obviously, but then I feel like proceeded to just absolutely nail that. You referenced that there's big changes that are sometimes made or by products or on products, and then there's like a before after type of situation. Have you personally been around with any of those big jumps? I feel like I'm pretty sure Edge has had a few kind of major iterations over the past 3 years. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's every company has a sort of different take on it, right? Like there are some companies that come up with a redesign all in one go. So I think Reddit is a sort of example that I can think of for that, where like they redesigned their whole like homepage experience and every part of the app and like the web experience, like all in one go. And then they put it on users and said, hey, like here's something new. You can go back to the old experience, but we would love for you to try this experience, right?
Teams is doing that rightly. Microsoft Teams.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. So Teams, like they published a big redesign and they have a toggle at the top that lets you like, go back and forth on it.
Yep.
But then there are products like Edge, where, the philosophy, and this goes to a lot of things, right? Like it's not like it's up to me to decide whether there should be like one whole redesign or like smaller things that we redesign. But some of the approaches that we've taken because of our like huge user base is to take our time and be very intentional with things, and change things like slowly and in different experiments. So one of the things that, and you mentioned as your takeaway for the previous answer was, like set intention and like know who's going to use these things.
Exactly.
Right? And for us, it's like doing that, but at a scale of like millions of people, right? So it's almost to the point where we need to test things individually. So it's like, it's called treatment versus control, right? Like it's basically A/B testing the things that you're doing. And we do that for each and every small change that we make, because like we realize the like difference that it makes to change the smallest things in something like a web browser. So in some ways, like it's very complicated, but I think the approach that I have seen in the redesigns that I've been a part of is to be like starting small with like smaller components and like changing things one at a time for the user and seeing how it affects their behavior, right? Like there's so much signals and telemetry and stuff that you can look at to see, hey, like if you change the design of a tab, are people using tabs less? And like, like if they're using tabs less, then they're using the browser less, which is like a big no-no. So I think, those are some of the redesign thoughts that I have personally seen.
Are you personally a fan of the incremental design, it sounds like, or do you think you can make a case for the complete revamp as well?
I think personally, like if it was something that I was building and like if I was the CEO, I would be a bigger fan of like changing everything in one go and presenting a vision to users about, hey, like here's an all new experience and this is why we did it, right? I think the why is really important, as we just talked about.
Absolutely.
But I think it's just about, when you think about these big companies, like the ship is huge and you can't just like turn the ship around in one go.
Yeah.
Like you have to do it like part by part. So I think I realized that the company that I worked for, has a certain set of business goals, and that's your job as a designer, right? Like you're not just here to make things look pretty. Like you're here because you understand the business, and you also have an eye for design and for quality.
Yeah.
So professionally, like at this company, things are done this way, and I totally respect that process.
Right, of course.
And maybe it's just hard for me to imagine the scale of that thing for my own product. So maybe if you made me the head of like Microsoft Edge tomorrow, maybe I would also, once I see everything in front of me, talk to the people that they have access to. Maybe I would also say that, hey, like we can't do this in one go. Like we have to do it bit by bit. But it's just the opinion that I have as a personal designer, maybe.
I would probably have a similar perspective on that. Going back to your point around the designers having individual prowess and kind of developing that over their work or over the years of their career, I'm just kind of curious to learn if you've ever, if not you yourself personally, but if you've ever seen any particular design that is maybe that I would have seen or our listeners might have, that was kind of developed just by somebody's, like just through a brainstorm where they were like, hey, I think, what, maybe we should do that. And then it just stuck and just one person's idea made its way all the way to the very top where it got to front of, as you referenced, millions of users. I'm just really curious to learn if that ever happens. And if so, if you have an example maybe for that.
It totally does. And, I can give you a personal example, but I can also share examples that I've seen on Twitter of people, right? But like, I think one really good thing about like the culture in tech companies is the idea of hackathons, right? Like you get a week or so to just like jam out on things that you wouldn't normally get to do. And for me, like one of those ideas was like split screen. So that's something like I felt really passionate about. I was like, dude, like there is no good way for you to have two tabs side by side on Edge right now, because like when you do, like you see like two separate windows fully like on your screen, right?
Yeah.
And like the tab strip and everything is like, it feels so redundant, but like what if you could just look at two tabs in the same like tab space and they're just half of the space, right? And
I see.
Like I built like a Figma prototype for it, and I shared it with a bunch of people. Like I submitted it to the hackathon, and it ended up winning like the best like user value hack.
Cool.
And I was like super excited about it, and I was like, yeah, like this means that we should go build this, right? And then soon enough, like the next hackathon came around. We do hackathons like twice or thrice a year at Microsoft, but like then at that point I grabbed a dev and I was like, hey, like can you help me actually build this? Like I want to see how hard it is for us to go and build it.
Yeah.
So like I found a bunch of talented devs and they helped me build it, and like that hackathon we actually built it. And then I could go to like the product team for tabs and be like, hey, like this doesn't seem that hard, and I feel like it has like a ton of value for users. And then from that step you do a bunch of user research on it, like do people really want it, like is this good for everyone, and stuff like that. But like surely enough, like if you look at Edge now, like it has split screen, and when you look at Twitter and all these other things, like there are so many like positive and uplifting tweets about Edge being one of like the only mainstream browsers to be able to do that now. So like that feels like a personal win to me. But I've also heard that something like Spotify Wrapped, which I'm sure like all of your listeners have probably heard of, like it was actually an intern's idea. Like an intern was like, hey, like we have all this data, why don't we just like make it into a capsule and like give it to our users at the end of every year? And think about it now, like it's one of their biggest features.
Yeah, it's almost a cultural phenomenon at this point. Anytime there's mid-December, all you can see people talk about is that the rap thing. But that's so cool, man. That's just incredible what you just laid out. I feel like I just learned so much about culture at Microsoft that encourages something like that. So kudos to you and Microsoft, honestly. What's your, or I guess maybe not your, although I'd be happy to hear that as well, but what's Microsoft's vision for Edge in this age of AI? And maybe this is where also we can delve a little bit more on the capabilities of AI when it pertains to web browsers in general or as a whole.
Yeah, I think the strategy is a work in progress, right? Like just to be totally transparent, like we have a new CEO. It's actually someone who invented Google DeepMind, or like a DeepMind that was later sold to Google. And like, he's been around in the industry for a really long time. He understands the ins and outs of this like totally. And I think from everything that I've seen in public interviews, because obviously I'm not allowed to share anything about like the confidential, like,
I wouldn't expect you
stuff,
to.
but yeah. And like, just, he has a very clear vision, right? Like, and that is that like AI is a companion, right? So I think that's sort of the vision of web browsing for the company, and not just our company. Like, I've seen so many of our competitors talk about browsing in the same way. And it gets me really excited, right? Because like, when you think of AI at the moment, it feels like a transitory thing that you use to help you with like a very small task. Like, hey, like, can you proofread this for me? Can you rewrite this for me? And, very basic use cases. But I think the industry in general is working towards memory, which is basically like the AI needs to start remembering the things that you talk to it about. And I think that's where the real power is. Because think about everything that you do inside a web browser, right? Like, your whole life is sort of based on a web browser. Like, whenever you go to a coffee shop, like, what's the one thing that people have open on their like computers? It's a web browser. So think about what a web browser can do when it remembers the things that you did on it, and how can it get you back to those things, and how can it help you achieve the things that you were doing faster. So that's sort of the vision for the industry as a whole. Everyone has a different take on it, and as the years go by, you can come back to this conversation and think about how like right I was. But I think we will start seeing this stuff really soon in all the products that we use, as like this AI stuff gets smarter.
Just so I understand this correctly, you're saying that there's a possibility that while I'm in bed and while I have programmed my Edge browser to go to, say, a certain site, maybe like I use Riverside for podcasts, so we'll just take Riverside and then perform clicks and such, and like I can automate it to do activities that I want it to do. Is that kind of what you were saying with memory and such, or am I way off, or is that just not possible?
I think it's a possibility, right? Like, it feels like a cool idea. Like, do you even have to navigate to the same websites that you do right now? Or
exactly,
can the browser do that for you and give you a summary of the things that you're looking at, right? And I think one piece I like didn't touch on, but is obviously super important, is trust. Like, none of this AI stuff will work if there is no trust between the agent and like the person itself. And I think, I'm going back to some of the stuff that I saw Apple announce at the start of this month, which is around just, I think they've done an amazing job at establishing that trust. Like, they've said that, all of this stuff is happening on your device. And like, even when we send things to the cloud, like, it's in a very like protected network that third party like security companies can like verify and stuff. So I think that part is like something that, every company is working towards, but we need to be very clear with our users that, hey, we're not spying on you, right? Like, the goal here isn't to like spy on you and like sell your data for ads and those sorts of things. It's more of like, how can we be like a personal companion to you no matter what you're doing on the internet? No one knows the right way of doing that yet. Everyone has ideas, everyone's working towards it, but I, for one, am really excited to be working in this space, because it feels like one of those like fundamental things where design, it plays a really important part, right? Because like, if you build a creepy experience, then no one's going to want to like be anywhere near it. But if you do it right and it feels magical, then like it will change how everyone in this world uses a computer.
Tushar, thank you so much today for taking the time and walking us through not just what you do, what your experiences have been, but also sharing some of the really amazing work that you've been doing. I, for one, will never look at or use Edge the same way again. Seriously, it's crazy what a big impact it makes to just meet somebody or have a man on the inside, Like, I know now that if next time I'm like trying to close or like install Chrome on a new Windows computer. And it's like, are you sure you want to do that? And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I think I want to do that. But I know who to go to for that feedback. And if not feedback, really just to, have a laugh about that. So really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you so, so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Naman.
That brings us to the end of episode 18 of the Ready Set Do podcast. I would like to thank you all for sharing these conversations with those who continue to benefit from them. If you would like to support me, please subscribe to my YouTube channel or leave me up to a 5-star rating on Spotify. New episodes every Wednesday. Catch you all in the next one.